Hi everyone, I'm Barry Topping. I'm the composer and sound designer on Paradise Killer, working with the lovely folks at Kaizen Gameworks. I just thought today it'd be nice to take some time to talk about the project, my involvement in it, the scope of that involvement, maybe some of the influences behind the project, have a listen to some tracks, break those down, and maybe take some questions too. So before we get into the game proper, I thought it would be nice to take a bit of time to talk about my working environment, which is a home studio I've got set up here. I have this lovely workstation desk I got from IKEA. Highly recommend it if you're looking for a big desk. Where I have my audio interface, which is a Behringer UFX. I have a pair of Presonus Eris E5 monitors, which are hooked up to the relevant subwoofer, which are great monitors for mixing. I have a tiny wee MIDI controller here on the desk, and I've got my big MIDI controller over here. The reason I have two MIDI controllers is because sometimes an idea comes so quickly, I have to get it down, because even the 5 seconds it takes me to spin my chair, it's gone. So this is like my insurance policy for making sure good ideas don't just vanish. I also have a guitar recording set up here, and I have a vocal recording set up. We actually recorded some vocals, and most of the guitar was done here. So I think I'm lucky to have a home recording set up, especially given what's been happening recently. So it's enabled me to work quickly and to get a lot of work done. We started this project back in January, and not even 4 months later we got 20 songs written. So it's been a fairly breakneck pace, but having a home studio that's equipped to be able to do things quickly and efficiently has made a huge difference to that. So when the guys at Kaizen came to me, they already had a pretty good idea of what they wanted for the soundtrack. You can see from any of the visual material for the game that it has a pretty distinct, striking vibe, and a vibe is what they had in mind for the soundtrack. There were already some guide tracks in there, but they weren't really suitable, so my first job was kind of to interpret the vibe they wanted and be able to turn that into a full soundtrack. So we had a lot of conversations about it, and I went away and started generating ideas. And generally the way we would work was I'd come up with a demo, I'd send it to them for approval, and then a couple of weeks later it'd be a full song. So the style, again, the visual style of this game is pretty striking, so we had to make sure that the audio style was equally striking. So I've written down some influences here, so if you think I'm reading off a list, it's because I am. So the main thing that came up when we first started was city pop. City pop, if you don't know, is kind of 70s, 80s, a bit of 90s era Japanese pop music. It's a very distinct style that fits with Paradise Killer's kind of aesthetic of palm trees and, Japanese style streets and that sort of thing. So we felt that city pop should be the main thread through the soundtrack. Obviously not the full soundtrack, because 20 city pop songs, it's not giving you the spectrum of what you need for a complete soundtrack. So I've written some stuff down here which were sort of my influences, and these were all things that started as city pop as a central genre and things that could be tied into that and expand out from that. So the soundtrack at large is, as I said, city pop inspired. There's also a lot of new disco inspiration, AOR as well, which is sort of West Coast 70s and 80s rock music. There's also one thing I wanted to tie into this was a sort of mid-fi kind of vibe. Also wanted something that was very reminiscent of like PS2, like PlayStation 2 soundtracks. I think the PS2 soundtrack as a thing, people don't really seem to talk about that much, but it has such a nice specific memory for a lot of people. So I really wanted to try and capture a bit of the PS2 style. So some of the artists I was taking inspiration from for this soundtrack were, well, a lot of city pop artists, people like Haruomi Hosono from Pacific, Yellow Magic Orchestra, love YMO, huge influence for me. Toshiki Kitamatsu as well, love his city pop albums, and there's thousands of city pop albums out there. If it's something you want to get into, there's so much. I also was really into a lot of kind of Japanese fusion. There's a band called T-Square that I absolutely love. They did a lot of music for Mario Kart 8. So if you like Mario Kart 8 music, you got to get into T-Square. Also a lot of AOR influence, like I mentioned, bands like Toto, Steely Dan. So these were the kind of main influences that I was trying to tie together, but make them modern. All the Paradise Killer soundtrack is a modern take on this stuff that I like. I wanted it to sound like a cohesive group of artists had made this soundtrack. An interesting thing about the game is the way the audio is implemented. There has to be a lot of freedom around what the player can listen to. So when writing an hour of music, you kind of have to write music that's appropriate for all the situations in the game. And that's kind of impossible, but it just means you have to have a spectrum of things where if a player, because you'll know from playing a game where you have a choice of music, if you feel the music you're listening to is inappropriate for the situation, you'll switch to another piece of music. So we had to make sure that even though we were hitting the brief, that there was a wide enough variety of stuff that would fit situations that the player wanted to hear that music in. So as I said before, work started in earnest sort of at the start of the year. We're about 4 months in now. And we have, I think by the time all's said and done, we're going to have about an hour of music, which covers what I've said. We have city pop songs, we have a couple new disco tunes, there's a lot of AOR stuff, we have a kind of New Jack Swing tune. So quite a wide variety of music, but all music I would say is very kind of exciting, danceable, fits with the kind of faux 80s beachy vibe of Paradise Killer as a whole. And yeah, when we hear some, I can tell you a bit more about the instrumentation. Okay, so here we have the stems for our main theme, Paradise brackets Stay Forever, which is an original, it's a vocal song. You're not going to hear vocals today, but it was written as a vocal song, and we will have those. This is an original city pop work by me. The thing about coming up with city pop is a lot of the modern interpretations of city pop, stuff like future funk, is all based on old samples, which for a commercial work we would never get cleared. So yeah, I mean, I had to come up with original city pop that sounded new, had a bit of a modern take, but also very much sounded like city pop, which I think I've achieved for the whole soundtrack. But this is one in particular. This was the first song we wrote, so it was really important that this established the style and the vibe. So what we have here, we have the first kind of 16 or so bars of the song, so let's have a listen to that. So part of making this soundtrack sound like a cohesive work of music created by an artist, a group of artists, meant that I wanted to have quite a band-based setup for all the songs. And obviously, it fits with the style too. So we can talk through sort of the individual parts of this song and the groups and kind of how they're recorded, how they're written, and how they relate back to the brief. We start off with the drums. I really wanted to have a kind of big 80s sound. I don't want to say sterile, but some 80s drums definitely are sterile. So I was trying to make something that sounded like, a big triggered electric kit, but also had a little bit of the kind of disco nuance of city pop. So the way I imagine these tunes are like in the world of Paradise Killer, city pop never went away, disco never went away, it's popular still, and it's just these are the versions of it that people are making now. So it has more of a modern sound, especially the way I didn't want the mastering to come off as kind of vintagey. So I know it sounds a bit much to say it's a modern take on city pop, but that's what I was going for. So if we have a listen to the drums here, we've got drums and percussion tracks here. So we have this kind of island percussion, which is nice. There's a lot of bongos in this soundtrack. And we have these big compressed gated reverb kick drum and snare drum coming up in a minute. So you can hear there, that's very much programmed drums, but that's fine. That's what we needed. So we have a lot of this kind of pattern of hats-based kind of city pop disco style beats, but it's really just about adding enough texture to the song for them not to be the focus, which is why I wanted quite a fat snare sound. It's not really a disco thing, I guess, like a big kind of fat modern snare, but I wanted something that still sounded like, you know, triggered programmed drums, but added a bit of body to the kit sound overall, because especially in sort of late 70s city pop, the drums are so far back sometimes they're not really a focus, and I don't want them to be a focus here, but I just wanted them to have a bit more presence. So I'll turn the bass bus on here and we can hear how, you know, how the kick and the snare especially sit with the bass. Wee chords there. So you get the idea. The next important thing for this arrangement, the soundtrack as a whole, is brass. I really love that 90s PC Engine CD T-Square, who I mentioned earlier, really fat keyboard brass sound, and it was important to me that the brass on this didn't sound like 4 people in a room recording, because it's not really the style I wanted. So the brass is a mixture of a bunch of different synths, and also we have some real brass in the form of the sax. So having the real sax and then the sort of synthesizer brass, it adds a bit of it fattens it up a lot, but it adds quite a bit of a humanist kind of tone. So I'll let you hear the brass bus on its own here. This is just all the synthesizer brass. So there's quite a lot of sounds in there. We got them down here. I've comped a bunch of brass from the Korg M1, which sounds like really kind of cartoony. And then I have this Halion brass sample here too. And then when you put the sax in with that, so like I said, the sax adds a lot of humanizing to that. So if we hear the sax in this together with this. So I mentioned before for the brass that we comped some sounds from the Korg M1, and the Korg M1 has been, no pun intended, instrumental in putting this soundtrack together. For anyone that doesn't know it, the Korg M1 is the sound of the 90s, the late 80s too. It pretty much, it had that kind of legendary synth status where it was on all the records at the time. And a lot of people feel like that era of synth sounds is cheap, and it is in a way, but I feel a lot of nostalgia for that sort of stuff that I don't really feel for kind of 70s analog stuff. So when I was starting out and picking synths, the main ones that I came upon were the Korg M1, the Roland JD series, and the Roland Sound Canvas, which all have this great kind of early 90s, like I said, kind of pop, new disco, and almost like this PC Engine CD vibe. Everything I write, you know, is a bit video gamey, but like sort of early PS1 PC Engine CD era sound is always something that's really interesting, because it's not chiptune. You can't just fire up a synth and you've got, like, you know, the sound of the PC Engine CD or the sound of the PS1. I think it's just about finding the synths that were sampled and, you know, the work that they did to make those not sound like just off-the-shelf samples. So the M1 was really a workhorse for this whole thing. And speaking of the M1, we have our wee bus here for strings. The strings on this project are a mix of real strings and then kind of some orchestral plugins and then some synth strings, but it was really just to add texture. So they have this kind of phasey thing going on. So this is wee synth pad. Then you have quite an abrupt change here. So that's, again, a lot of string sounds layered, but then compressed down almost to sound more narrow. And then we have all our piano textures under here too. We have electric piano. Let's move along here. Very nice. Big thing that was important to me about this was having non-obvious harmony. Like I said, I've been listening to a lot of Steely Dan, so I spent a lot of time finding chord sequences that weren't quite predictable, that had a lot of interesting chords, a lot of inversions. And I love the electric piano, so there's a lot of electric piano throughout this soundtrack. And we have a wee Page piano here. So this is more kind of a total vibe, this piano. This is our wee intro here. You have that electric piano there. Cool. So the last part I want to talk about here is the guitars. Guitars throughout are a mix of programmed stuff and a mix of real stuff. I have I'll put the pictures up. I got a Les Paul and a Stratocaster, and they were used extensively, obviously for different things, but there were a couple of things where, again, I wanted an almost artificial sound for some stuff. And guitar is, for years and years, guitar plugins were always terrible, but they've got to a point now where they're actually pretty good, and you can still make them sound like very kind of robotic. So 70-80% of the guitar on this soundtrack is me or another guy, but then there's a wee bit of program stuff too, which I think is quite nice. So what we have here is some layered up Strat parts and a wee Les Paul part. I'll just play that for you. So we have a big guitar chord here, and then this wee kind of picking part, quite kind of Lindsey Buckingham part, I think. Cool. So you get an idea of the kind of different parts there. So let's hear it one more time. I love how the brass sounds. I love that. Cool. So that's the first section. There's one more section I wanted to talk about here. This is the midsection. Going back to what I said about AOR influence, this section is sort of after the first chorus, very influenced by Toto. So we'll have you listen to it. 8-pin sax there at the end. So we can break this part down a wee bit. Percussion wise, it's pretty similar to what we had before. I have these huge 80s toms here that I love, so we'll play through from here just so we can hear them. That very kind of EastEnders tom. Let's hear that again. Huge. So very much the same kind of stuff for the drums. Even though they're programmed, I wanted to have tons of like wee kind of snare rushes and kind of grace notes and stuff in this. So even though they're mostly sitting pretty quantized to the beat, I didn't want it all to just be kind of mash tatties, as we call it in Scotland, just straight up. So there's lots of kind of wee fills here and there, stuff like that. And we have this wee snare rush at the end here. Just stuff like that, just to make it a bit more interesting. So we have the same kind of brass patterns through here, mixture of stabs. Bongo Fury in the background there. I'll come to the sax solo, but the main sort of part here is built around this kind of total, again, this total style idea, so I'll play that for you. Big synths here. This is... And then, when you think it can't get any more 80s... Yes. There is a particular sound here that I love. It's just this. It's just this big kind of FM style bass pulse. But it really puts me in mind of Michael Bolton. For any Michael Bolton fans out there, this is a section I refer to as the Michael Bolton section. So we can just hear this. So you get this big, it adds more at a time when it's already hitting a crescendo. You get, with a guitar and this, you get this. Just huge. So there's a tiny wee picked guitar part through here. There's a lot of 80s style kind of Steve Lukather, Michael Jackson kind of parts. This is a bit unlike the others because I saw an interview with this guy, Tobias Forge, who is in a band called Ghost, and something he said that I thought was amazing is he writes and records most of the parts for his album. And when he started out with the first one, he had this idea about the two guitarists in his band where one of them was like a good guitarist and the other one wasn't. And so he tried to give the parts different personalities based around how they would play. And I never really thought of that before, because anytime I would write a guitar part, it would really just be how I'd play it. So I tried to imagine for the soundtrack that there were 2 or 3 different guitar players. So this falls into the sort of the guitarist B group that I have in my head. So it's a kind of 80s style part, but it has a slightly different tone and it's more kind of back in the mix. So I'll let you hear it with the bass and the drums. Big key change there, and I love that the sax, you wouldn't even blink at that key change because the sax does such a good job. So we go up a semitone, then down a semitone, so I'll let you hear that. So these are both sections of Paradise Stay Forever, which you'll hear in our new trailer. So I just wanted to really talk through them and, you know, give you an idea of my motivations, my inspirations, and really how a lot of these songs are built. The closer we get to release, we'll be sharing a lot of different music that doesn't sound like this. But this gives you an idea of what I mean when I talk about a modern take on city pop. So like I said, this was written as a vocal song. We recorded vocals with amazing local singer, I know, Fiona Lynch. Cannot wait to let everyone hear the finished version of this song. It is one of my favourite pieces of music I've ever written, so very excited to let people hear that. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the sound design. As I said right back at the start, we wanted to make sure we married the sound design with the music. And what that means is that sound design should really be an extension of the music for me. The sounds themselves should be reminiscent of the instrumental sounds in the music. And again, when we have such a strong style as Paradise Killer, it's, you know, you get an idea what that would work. The thing I kept saying was spa sounds. Everything, I wanted everything to sound watery and kind of, you know, fantasy and like relaxing. I didn't want everything to be kind of like stock for what you'd expect. So an interesting bit here is where we have the sound design directly influenced by the music. Throughout the soundtrack, there are a couple of themes, leitmotifs, if you want to be fancy, that I like to come back to, just because I think conceptual continuity over a full soundtrack is not only cool, it's interesting, but when people hear something they recognise from another song, they're like, oh, it's that bit. I've always loved that, so I wanted to make sure we had that. So we have a couple of main themes throughout Paradise Stay Forever that appear through other songs, so keep your ears peeled. But one of the themes we have is this. So that wee motif, I saw it almost as Lady Love Die's theme in a way. So one thing we wanted to do is bring that theme over to Starlight, her computer. So what we've done is when you get a call in Starlight, this is the wee ringtone. Which is just this theme. I think it's little things like that that help tie a soundtrack together overall. Yeah, I just thought that was a nice little thing. So I just grabbed a couple other sound effects here I thought were quite nice. We have this boot complete sound effect. When doing big sound effects like this, I think it's always important to do 2 or 3 so you can see what fits in with the game. So we have this kind of analog synth vibe style one, then we have another one here, which is more kind of vocal. This, to me, puts me in mind of the sort of bust statues, you know? That kind of vaporwave bust statue vibe. Then we have this, which is more like the sort of spa vibe I was talking about a wee minute ago. So there are a lot of sound effects like this, and I just wanted to make them not jarring, not take you out of the environment, because so much of what Paradise Killer is to me is just that atmos, that vibe. We've been saying vibe a lot, but I think these are all pretty aesthetic, as people would say. So there's a ton of music and a ton of sound design, but I just wanted to talk about a couple of wee bits just to give you an idea, because we'll be showing a lot more of it as we get closer to launch. So hopefully it's been informative in a way and we'll kind of get you excited about the soundtrack. So yeah, I think we got some questions from some people, so we can have a look at some of those. First one is from Christopher Mick, who asks, how have you adjusted to take looping/dynamic track changes into account? When we started out, most of these tracks were all going to loop, and as such I had to provide stems based in groups, which meant they could be mixed dynamically within Unreal. As things progressed, we moved sort of less from looping tracks to more complete tracks, but you know, we still did the groundwork of how that would work, and I think it's really just about making sure the stems are grouped correctly, because if you have 30 stems, it's impossible to mix between them in Engine. But it was really just about how you kind of present that track. Looping wise as well, it's important to know where your loop point is. A lot of the tunes are kind of longer. They're kind of 2-3 minute songs that would have looped as opposed to, 30-second loops. But the only thing you have to really take into account is whether it's going to loop or not. But, like I said, we got to a point where it didn't loop anymore, so then had to go back and write outros for all these songs. Kichi Goto asks, are there any songs with a big mad 3-minute bass solo, and if not, why not? You will have to buy Paradise Killer to find out. Woodaba asks, following the tradition of every good video game from the early 2000s, will there be a Paradise Killer rap over the end credits? There may be rapping. You just have to wait and see. Sean Noonan asks, what are the most common misconceptions you see and hear around sound design? This has not been the case with Paradise Killer, but a problem I've came across in the past is that people want to tack audio onto the end of a project, or it's too far down the pipeline. Audio can push your game over the edge into something truly amazing. I mean, anyone knows that who's really, really loved a soundtrack or really loved sound design. And I think more developers could involve audio as a more important part of their development process sooner in that process. So I would say that is the biggest common misconception, that audio is the thing you can just do at any point. You can come to it at the end, but it'll ultimately be much stronger if it's involved at the base level of a project. Chopamon asks, which is your favourite track? My favourite track changes every day. As we came to the end of the recording process and I started getting more saxophone back, recording more guitar, songs started filling out more and became my favourites. But my two favourites just now are a track called End of the World, which is a kind of reggae synth vibe, which is super nice, and a track called To the Heart, which is a full screaming 80s AOR style song, has a huge sax solo, huge guitar solo, very danceable. So those are probably my favourites. Chopamon asks again, you sit down to compose a new track with a blank canvas. What is the first step? It really depends. For this project, it was a variety of things. At one point I had a text document that just had a list of ideas in it that were just words like fun beachy vibe, driving at night, sipping a cocktail, stuff like that. So sometimes you just have a sentence or a mental image in your head, and then you sit down and then it's, do you play something? Do you pick a sound? I'd say they were my main ones, is either firing up a sound and, sitting at the piano until something comes out, or trying to find a specific sound. Sometimes even just hitting the same note over and over again while you try and pick a sound on a synthesizer is, it's how you start a song. Entire songs are built around a sound. So it really depends. But for this, it was a lot of ideas that made sure we had a nice spread of different styles, and then trying to make those come out. Bitsocket asks, have you ever finished a track and realised you've accidentally ripped off another song? Everyone has done that. There are only so many keys, so many chords, but the important thing is, even if you did be like, oh, that sounds like that, an entire song is never going to be wholesale lifted from another song. So it's not something it's ever been an issue for me, but it does happen. You sit down, you start playing your guitar and you're like, I've rewritten Smells Like Teen Spirit. Isn't that amazing? Tamachan87 asks, do you use any middleware? If not, were there any limitations you face when implementing the music? Phil is our resident master of all trades. So Phil was doing most of the implementation side on this, just because I came into the process a bit later. But I know from talking to him and what we've done is that we're just using Unreal, just the in-engine stuff. Cool, so thanks very much for your questions. Hopefully this whole thing's been informative, and it kind of is a taster of what we got to come. I said this before, but I am super excited to share the rest of the soundtrack. I think it's nostalgic, it has completely original elements, it has it fits the game in a way that is quite unique to this style of game. I'm just really excited for people to play it, for people to hear the music. And yep, thanks very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. Thanks.